Hey everybody, Stephen Bogran here from Pro Physique. Today I'm talking about protein!
My name is Steven, and this is our video about health and fitness things. And I work for Pro Physique, and I am just a guy with a fitness thing for you.
Alright, I hope you all are having a great day so far. Man, what a topic to discuss. And it's important and it matters. But I think a lot of us maybe don't recognize or maybe forget sometimes why it matters and maybe what some of the recommendations are for protein and for how we kind of manage that throughout our dieting phases and particularly maybe our improvement phases. For me, protein's gonna stay pretty stable regardless. And so it kind of ends up being this really nice, just like set point or like, hey, this is my protein, cool. But it can sometimes change. And for a lot of you out there that have maybe gotten into meal plans or bodybuilding or maybe like a bro approach, you may be seeing or maybe have seen some significantly high protein intake numbers. For example, I always love remembering this one. My protein back when I met Paul, for example, I was with the coach that had me on 400 grams of protein per day. Extremely high protein intake. Ooh, zero reason for that, okay? So it can be something that we see go way off the radar and kind of be like, whoa. And it can differ a little bit depending on hey, are we a physique athlete? Are we trying to maximize building as much muscle as we can? Or are we just kind of trying to be healthy and not maybe as worried about it? So let's start with those of you who are just kind of I'm not really trying to be the biggest person in the world. I don't want to do competitive physique sports. I just want to be healthy and I want to be in a good spot. Well, your RDA for protein is going to be on the lower side. However, we do still want to make sure we're getting enough protein. Making sure that we're getting enough protein helps us with a few things. And what does that mean? Because making sure we get enough protein for you is probably going to mean something different than making sure we're getting enough protein for someone else. And remember, everything for protein is relative, which means it is going to be dependent on your body weight. And maybe not necessarily just your body weight, the number on the scale, because some of us maybe have a little bit more body fat than others, and that might not be as indicative. So where I really like to put that number in terms of protein is where we're gonna estimate your lean body mass. This one's easier for competitors because oh, I'm just gonna think of my stage weight, or what I think my stage weight's gonna be. And that's probably pretty close. However, we can maybe guesstimate and look at some things there to help you guys as well. And so for me, I normally like to look at height and gender as good ones, right? So if we're just a Gen Pop person and we're 5'4", cool, we can probably get away with 100, 110 grams of protein a day pretty easily. Should be more than enough. There is some caveat here to this protein intake and what we want to see there though. And this is where things kind of start becoming important. We want to be understanding of complete proteins, which means it has all of our essential amino acids within it. But we also want to make sure that we're getting enough protein. This is where the bro diet stuff can really kind of miss the mark, I think. Particularly if your protein may be lower. If you're trying to get 100 grams of protein in per day, and you're trying to get 5 meals a day, that's 20 per meal. Depending on your body mass, depending how muscular you may or may not be, that may not be enough. And it may not be enough in each of those meals to get enough complete proteins to really trigger what we would call muscle protein synthesis, or muscle growth from our nutrition, our protein intake. For someone like that, it would probably make more sense to do a breakfast, lunch, and dinner and get roughly 30 grams of complete proteins per meal. We'll obviously have some incomplete proteins there just based on if we have some vegetables or some other things. But we're overdoing it where we have some wiggle room here. We have some space to work with in terms of making sure we're getting enough of the complete proteins to trigger that muscle growth. And essentially what they are talking about here is getting enough complete proteins to build and enough leucine so that everything in the cascade kind of triggers to say, okay, hey, look, we can rebuild muscle and make new muscle, and we can do those things. Now, this becomes more important for competitors. And this is where most competitors, most physique athletes are probably going to have a little bit higher protein intake. Generally speaking, most of us just go with 1 gram per pound of body weight. Again, this can absolutely still go towards your projected stage weight or your lean body mass. And that's gonna be just fine. It's gonna be enough protein to get what you need. Any kind of natural athlete is going to be limited in terms of like muscle building, we'll say muscle building for protein intake, right? You can still utilize extra protein as calories. It's a little bit more difficult because you have to take this complete protein, break it down into its amino acids, shuttle it through the body, transfer it and make it into glucose, and then shuttle it through the body again to be used. So it does tend to be something that I think a lot of us overeat on because it has that higher thermic effect is what we call it. It takes more calories, more work to break it down and use it for energy. And therefore it tends to be one of those things we can get away with eating more of. What we want to be careful with is, and this is something I see a lot of, our calories are high, but we're a 110-pound competitor eating 180 grams of protein. No, our calories are not high, our protein is high. Just because, again, because protein takes all this energy, it takes so much more, it doesn't tend to give us the same result as something like carbohydrates or fats. And with that in mind, it may make more sense for you to start slowly switching over some of that excessive protein intake into a more energy yielding nutrient like carbohydrates or fats. Now, that being said, say I have a 110-pound competitor, that's their stage weight, and we're eating 140 grams of protein or 130 grams of protein. Is that too much? Not necessarily. The reason we can see those higher protein intakes that are maybe a little bit more, or a reasonable amount more than what we need, is because it does tend to be heavier in the stomach, it tends to be more satiating, it tends to keep us fuller, which can really help, especially when we're dieting. Can help keep us on track so that we're not overeating everything. And that can be a big benefit there. But the same rules will apply. And what we think about here is what I call getting enough protein and what is called the refractory period of protein theory. Whew, that's a lot. But essentially what they did is they IV'd amino acids into somebody. And they said, okay, well, what's gonna happen? And amino acids are proteins. So they IV'd them in and boom, we saw muscle protein synthesis or muscle building spike, boop. Well, what happened was as they stayed elevated, it didn't spike again. It didn't stay up. That muscle growth did its thing and came back down. However, when blood amino acids came back down, now we could spike it again. So we do still want to be aware of not only the amount of protein that we're getting, but making sure that we have enough time in between those protein feedings to account for this refractory period theory. Essentially what that means is I like to try and have a minimum of 3 hours in between my protein feedings. That way I can eat my protein, spike muscle growth nutritionally, and then allow that to come back down. Now I can eat my next meal and do the same thing again. And now it becomes this kind of trick of, all right, how do we get as many as possible? For me, I love doing a normal breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and then having something like maybe post-workout or a shake or that kind of thing to get my protein intake to maybe where I want it to be in total for the day. But I do try and make sure that I space that out enough to allot for time for those amino acids to come back down to normal. Now, this also means I have to get enough complete proteins, same as anybody else. I have to have enough of them and I need enough leucine. If you're eating animal protein, you won't have any problem with that. It should be very straightforward. Where this becomes a concern or a thought that we need to be aware of is for any of my vegetarian or vegan athletes, anyone who's plant-based. This is where we have to start learning, looking at, and pairing those amino acid profiles to allow ourselves to find complete proteins and make sure that we're getting enough leucine to do these same things. It's absolutely doable. I have plenty of people that do it. There are supplements as well that are going to have full amino acid profiles, as well as other food sources like seitan, tofu, and these kind of things. Again, you just have to make sure that they work for your total daily macros. And that's where kind of this plug and play and figuring it out kind of happens. So it's all doable, but protein is super important. I wanted to talk about it just a little bit. Make sure you're getting enough protein, make sure you're getting enough leucine, and make sure you're spacing it out so that we're getting enough muscle building.